November 10, 1943, Tropical Bay Island, South Pacific, 0600 hours. The jungle breathed its morning exhalation, thick, wet, rotting, into Staff Sergeant Leonard Smith's face as he pressed himself against the muddy root ball of a fallen banyan tree. Somewhere in the canopy above, a bird screamed. Or maybe it was a Japanese lookout signaling. After 72 hours without sleep, Smith could no longer distinguish between the sounds of nature and the sounds of death. His hands trembled as he lifted the Springfield rifle to his shoulder. Not from fear. He'd moved beyond fear 3 islands ago. But from exhaustion so profound it had become a physical entity, a weight pressing down on his chest with every breath. Through the rifle's scope, he could see nothing but green. Impenetrable, hostile, suffocating green. Then came the sound that had killed 17 men in his company over the past week. A single crack, sharp and clean, cutting through the jungle's constant whisper. Private Morrison, 23 years old, from Des Moines, Iowa, dropped without a word, a neat hole appearing just above his left eye. The Japanese sniper had fired from somewhere, anywhere, in the cathedral of trees that surrounded them. And like every other time, he would vanish before anyone could return fire. Smith lowered his rifle and stared at the crushed soup can beside his boot. Army-issue chicken concentrate. He'd eaten it for breakfast, crouched in this same position, spooning the tasteless gray paste directly from the tin, because heating it would have given away his position. The can was battered, dented, worthless. He'd intended to bury it. Instead, he picked it up and turned it slowly in his hands, watching how the early morning light caught its curved surface. Something shifted in his mind. Not quite a thought, more like a door opening in a dark room. The war had come to Tropical Bay Island with the force of industrial civilization colliding with primordial wilderness. On November 8, 1943, the 1st Marine Division had landed on beaches that had never seen a footprint larger than a wild pig's. Within 6 hours, they'd established a beachhead. Within 12, they'd pushed 3 miles inland. Within 24, they'd learned that taking ground in the Pacific meant nothing if you couldn't hold it. The Japanese 57th Infantry Regiment, under the command of Major Kyoto Nakamura, had spent 11 months transforming this island into a maze of death. They'd learned from Guadalcanal, from Tarawa, from every costly mistake of the early war years. They didn't build obvious bunkers or fight suicidal banzai charges. Instead, they'd become ghosts in the Green Cathedral, appearing only long enough to kill before dissolving back into the jungle's infinite hiding places. Their snipers were artists of patience. They would wait for days in the fork of a tree or the hollow of a fallen log, subsisting on rice balls and rainwater, their bodies wrapped in vegetation so completely that even standing 5 feet away, an American patrol might see only branches and leaves. They observed patterns, learned schedules, identified leaders. Then they fired once, never twice from the same position, and disappeared. By November 10th, the Marines had advanced 4 miles inland and lost 83 men. Not to conventional combat, there had been almost no conventional combat, but to snipers, ambushes, and booby traps. The Japanese had surrendered ground readily, even eagerly, drawing the Americans deeper into terrain they'd spent a year preparing. Every trail was a potential killing ground, every clearing a shooting gallery. Every silence a held breath before violence. The Marines called it ghost hunting. You couldn't see the enemy, couldn't predict them, couldn't fight them with superior firepower or coordinated assaults. Traditional infantry tactics meant nothing when your opponent refused to present a target. Men began to crack under the psychological pressure. They fired at shadows, wasted ammunition on bird calls, froze in their foxholes rather than risk movement during daylight. Colonel Harrison, commanding the 1st Battalion, stood in the forward command post, a hastily dug hole covered with palm fronds and camouflage netting, and studied the map with the exhausted attention of a man watching his careful plans dissolve into chaos. In theory, his battalion controlled the territory from the beach to this line, 4 miles inland. In practice, they controlled only the exact ground their bodies occupied at any given moment. 20 yards into the jungle in any direction, the Japanese owned the war. "We're not fighting an army," he said to his executive officer, Captain Matthews. "We're fighting the goddamn jungle itself. It's alive with them, and we can't kill what we can't see." Matthews, who'd been awake for 48 hours straight, simply nodded. What else could he do? They'd tried saturation fire, wasting thousands of rounds shooting into likely sniper positions. They'd tried artillery barrages, destroying vast swaths of jungle and achieving nothing but noise and crater. They'd tried sending out hunter-killer teams of their own snipers, but American sharpshooters, trained in the open country of rifle ranges and the forests of North Carolina, were helpless in this vertical maze where sight lines measured in feet, not yards, and where the enemy had spent months memorizing every tree, every shadow, every killing angle. The problem was doctrinal. American military thinking emphasized overwhelming firepower, coordinated maneuver, combined arms. It was a doctrine designed for the battlefields of Europe, where armies met in relatively open terrain, and victory came through superior logistics and industrial might. But here, on this forgotten scrap of volcanic rock and primordial jungle, those advantages meant nothing. You couldn't bring tanks through vegetation so thick a man needed a machete to advance 10 feet. You couldn't coordinate artillery when you couldn't see more than 30 yards. You couldn't use air power when the enemy lived beneath a canopy so dense it appeared solid from above. The Japanese, by contrast, had adapted. They'd embraced the jungle, learned to use it, become part of it. They fought the way men fight who know they cannot win through strength alone, with cunning, deception, psychological warfare. They understood that in this environment, the goal wasn't to kill every enemy soldier, but to make every moment of survival exhausting, every step forward terrifying, every decision fraught with the possibility of sudden death. And it was working. Staff Sergeant Leonard Smith had grown up in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the kind of poverty that teaches adaptation or extinction. The son of a coal miner who died of black lung when Leonard was 12, he'd learned early that survival meant seeing opportunities others miss. While other boys his age were playing baseball or chasing girls, Leonard was in the hills with his grandfather's rifle, hunting squirrels and rabbits for the family pot. Not for sport, for food. Ammunition was expensive. Every shot had to count. His grandfather, a weathered man who'd fought in the Spanish-American War and still spoke occasionally of the Siege of Santiago, had taught him the art of stillness. "A hunter don't move," he'd say, his voice rough as gravel. "World moves around him. You wait, you watch, you breathe so quiet, even your own heart don't know you're there. Then, when the moment comes, you don't think. Thinking's too slow. You just know." Leonard had been good at it, better than good. By the time he was 15, he could drop a squirrel from 80 yards with iron sights, hitting it in the head to preserve the meat. He learned to read the forest, to see not just what was there, but what was about to be there. The twitch of a branch before the deer emerged, the rustle of leaves before the covey of quail took flight. Nature had patterns, rhythms, tells. You just had to learn to read them. When the war came, Leonard enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Not from patriotism, though he felt that too, but from pragmatism. The mines were cutting back, work was scarce, and the military offered 3 meals a day and a paycheck. Besides, he figured his skills might translate. He was right. The Marine Corps Sniper School at Camp Lejeune recognized something in him that transcended marksmanship. He could shoot, certainly. He'd scored expert on the rifle range within his first week. But more importantly, he could wait. While other recruits fidgeted, complained, struggled with the tedium of holding position for hours, Leonard simply turned off some internal switch and became a thing of wood and stone. Time meant nothing to him. Discomfort meant nothing. There was only the sight picture, the target, the moment of perfect alignment between intention and action. They taught him the technical aspects of long-range shooting, windage, elevation, the Magnus effect of the bullet's spin, the way humidity affected trajectory. They taught him camouflage, fieldcraft, how to move through terrain without disturbing it. But they couldn't teach patience, stillness, the hunter's instinct for reading an environment. That he'd brought with him from the Kentucky hills. By the time he shipped out to the Pacific in March of 1943, Staff Sergeant Leonard Smith had become what the Marine Corps called a designated marksman, a hybrid between a regular rifleman and a full sniper. He had the skills, but lacked the specialized equipment of the dedicated sniper teams. He carried a standard-issue Springfield M1903 with a Unertl 8-power scope, not the specially selected and accurized weapons of the true snipers. His job was to embed with regular infantry units and provide precision fire support when opportunities presented themselves. He'd fought on Guadalcanal, where the Japanese had still been learning jungle warfare themselves. He'd fought on New Georgia, where the lessons had started to harden into doctrine. And now, on Tropical Bay Island, he was facing an enemy that had perfected the art of invisible warfare. For 3 days, he'd tried every technique he knew. He'd studied the jungle, looking for irregularities in the vegetation that might conceal a hide. He'd watched for muzzle flashes, though the Japanese had learned to shield those. He'd looked for the glint of scope glass, though they'd learned to use improvised sunshades and fire with iron sights. He'd tried to predict their positions based on likely fields of fire, but the jungle offered 1,000 likely positions, and he could watch only one at a time. 17 men had died on his watch. 17 times the crack of a rifle had shattered the morning or afternoon or evening silence, and 17 times Leonard had been unable to respond. The sniper, or snipers, there might have been several, he couldn't tell, was operating on a level of skill and preparation that exceeded anything he'd encountered before. And then, on the morning of November 10th, exhausted and frustrated, and staring at a crushed soup can, Leonard Smith's mind made a connection that would change the course of the battle. The idea came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow crystallization of observation, frustration, and memory. Leonard sat in his muddy depression behind the banyan root, turning the soup can in his hands, watching light play across its dented surface. The morning sun, angling through a gap in the canopy approximately 40 degrees above the eastern horizon, caught the can's curve and threw a brief, bright reflection across the jungle floor. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds before the can's rotation carried the reflective surface past the angle of incidence. But in those 2 seconds, Leonard's hunter's brain registered something important. The flash of light had moved, not randomly, but directionally, controlled, predictable. He thought about the Japanese sniper who'd killed Morrison. The man, and Leonard was certain it was a single individual, not multiple snipers, based on the consistent shot placement and timing, had to be somewhere in an arc of approximately 90 degrees, elevation between 20 and 40 feet, distance between 150 and 300 yards. That description encompassed roughly 12,000 square yards of jungle, containing several thousand potential firing positions. Impossible odds for conventional counter-sniper work. But what if you didn't need to find the sniper? What if you could make the sniper find you? No, not find you, find something else, something that appeared to be you but wasn't. Leonard's grandfather had taught him about duck hunting on the Tennessee River. You didn't chase ducks. You put out decoys, crude wooden approximations of real ducks, and waited for the real birds to come investigate. Ducks were curious creatures. They saw other ducks and assumed safety, food, companionship. Their curiosity overrode their caution. Were Japanese snipers curious? More importantly, were they trained to respond to light? Leonard thought through what he knew about Japanese military doctrine, which wasn't much beyond what he'd learned through observation and captured documents. The Japanese emphasized night attacks and dawn raids. They used signal flares extensively. Their naval forces communicated with blinker lights. Light meant communication, coordination, command. But more fundamentally, light meant attention. Human psychology, and Leonard had to assume that Japanese snipers, however skilled, were still human, was hardwired to respond to sudden visual stimuli. A flash of light in a dark forest demanded investigation. Was it a signal? A reflection off equipment? The scope of an enemy sniper? The Japanese sniper had all the advantages of position, preparation, and patience. But he also had the burden of responsibility. He was an observer, a lookout, possibly a forward spotter for artillery. His job wasn't just to kill Americans. It was to watch them, track their movements, report their positions. A flash of light in his sector would be, by definition, his problem to solve. He would have to look. And when he looked, he would expose himself. The theory was sound. The execution would require precision. Leonard spent the next 4 hours preparing his experiment with the methodical care of a scientist designing a critical test. He worked in his concealed position, moving only his hands, making no sound louder than the rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. First, he examined the soup can. Army issue chicken concentrate, type C ration, manufactured by Heinz Company, net weight 12 ounces. The can was constructed of tin-plated steel, approximately 3 inches in diameter and 4 inches tall. Both ends had been opened, the lid with a standard P38 can opener, the bottom with his K-bar knife. The resulting cylinder had rough edges that he carefully smoothed with a stone, working slowly to avoid creating noise. The exterior surface was moderately reflective, but covered with the standard Army drab olive paint and various dents and scratches from being carried in his pack. Not reflective enough for his purposes. Using a combination of wet mud and gentle abrasion with fine sand, he removed the paint from a section of the can approximately 2 inches wide and 3 inches long, exposing the bright tin plating beneath. This gave him a curved mirror, roughly 6 square inches in area, small enough to be manageable, large enough to throw a visible reflection. Next, he needed a mounting system. The can had to be positioned in a location that appeared to be a potential sniper hide, somewhere the Japanese would find plausible as an American position, but separated from his actual location by enough distance to avoid drawing fire to himself. It also had to be controllable from concealment. He selected a position approximately 50 yards to his left and slightly forward, near the base of a large mahogany tree. The area offered good sight lines toward the Japanese-held territory, adequate cover for a sniper, and enough elevation difference from his own position that the two locations clearly occupied different tactical ground. Most importantly, there was a natural depression, perhaps an old pig wallow, that would allow him to approach the position using dead ground, invisible to observation from the Japanese lines. He waited until 1400 hours, when the afternoon rain arrived with its usual tropical punctuality. Under cover of the downpour's white noise, rain hitting leaves with the sound of continuous static, he crawled to the position. The journey took 40 minutes. He moved inches at a time, redistributing his weight so gradually that the vegetation barely trembled. His grandfather would have approved. At the mahogany tree, he drove a wooden stake into the ground, using the butt of his K-bar, muffling each impact with a folded cloth. The stake stood approximately 18 inches high and was positioned so that its top would be visible from the Japanese-held ridge to the east, but concealed from most other angles by the tree's buttress roots. He'd carved a small notch in the stake's top to serve as a cradle for the soup can. The control mechanism was simple. A length of olive drab parachute cord, scavenged from a supply drop, attached to the can and running back to his primary position. By pulling the cord, he could rotate the can on its vertical axis. The rotation would cause the reflective surface to sweep through an arc, catching and reflecting sunlight in a controlled manner. But there was a problem. He needed to see what the reflection was doing without exposing himself to observation. He solved this by punching a small hole, approximately 1/8 inch in diameter, through the can's wall using the tip of his knife. By positioning his eye close to his end of the parachute cord and looking along its length toward the can, he could see through this spy hole and observe where the reflection was pointing. The entire apparatus was crude, improvised, assembled from garbage and scavenged materials. But it embodied a sophisticated understanding of optics, psychology, and tactical deception. By 1600 hours, Leonard was back in his primary position, with the parachute cord in his hand. The rain had stopped. The jungle steamed in the afternoon heat. He settled in to wait for the right conditions. He would need the sun at a specific angle, low enough to penetrate the canopy gaps, high enough to provide strong directional light. Based on his observation of the morning light patterns, the ideal window would be the first hour after dawn or the last hour before dusk. He decided to wait for dawn. His reasoning was tactical. Japanese snipers were most active in early morning when shadows were long and American troops were emerging from their nighttime positions. The enemy would be alert, watching, vulnerable to distraction. That night, Leonard did not sleep. He lay in his position, feeling the damp earth slowly leach heat from his body, listening to the jungle's nocturnal symphony. Somewhere in the darkness, the Japanese sniper was doing the same, waiting, watching, preparing for the morning's work. But Leonard had something the sniper didn't, a plan that turned the enemy's skills against him. November 11th, 1943, 05:45 hours. The jungle emerged from darkness with the gradual reluctance of a creature waking from troubled sleep. First came the sounds, birds tentatively announcing their territories, insects resuming their endless drone, the distant rumble of artillery from the northern sector, where 2nd Battalion was pressing toward the island's airfield. Then came the shapes, trees separating from the general blackness, leaves acquiring individual identity, the ground revealing its textures of root and mud and rotting vegetation. And finally, light. The sun rose over the eastern ocean, invisible behind the island's central ridge, but announcing itself through the gradual brightening of the sky. For 20 minutes, the jungle existed in that pre-dawn twilight where human eyes struggle to achieve clarity. Then, at 06:07 hours, the first direct rays of sunlight penetrated the canopy gap approximately 60 yards east of Leonard's position. He watched the light move across the jungle floor like a slow tide, illuminating first the highest leaves, then descending through the vertical maze of vegetation until it touched the ground. When it reached the position of his soup can decoy, he very gently pulled the parachute cord. The can rotated on its stake. The polished section of tin caught the morning sun, and a bright lance of reflected light stabbed across the jungle, painting a circle of brightness on the trunk of a tree approximately 200 yards distant, in the heart of Japanese-held territory. Leonard held the cord tension steady, keeping the reflection in place. Through his improvised sight hole, he could see the bright spot on the tree trunk. He counted slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At 7 seconds, he released the cord tension slightly, allowing the can to rotate past the angle of reflection. The bright spot disappeared. He waited 5 seconds, then pulled the cord again, re-establishing the reflection. Bright spot reappeared. 3 seconds. Gone. Wait. Back again. The pattern was irregular enough to appear accidental, not the steady rhythm of a signal light, but the random flashing of sunlight catching metal. A careless sniper adjusting his scope. A soldier shifting position, his rifle catching the light. The kind of mistake green troops made, the kind of thing an experienced observer would notice and investigate. Leonard let the pattern continue for 90 seconds, then released the cord entirely and turned his attention to his rifle. The Springfield was already positioned, its bipod legs sunk into the mud for stability. The scope focused on a section of jungle approximately 180 yards distant and 15 degrees north of the decoy's position. This was his calculated kill zone, the area where a Japanese sniper observing the decoy would most likely be positioned to have both a good view of the American lines and adequate concealment. He controlled his breathing. In through the nose, 4 counts. Hold, 2 counts. Out through the mouth, 6 counts. His heart rate, elevated by anticipation, began to slow. His hands, which had trembled with exhaustion yesterday, were now steady. The hunter's trance was settling over him, that state of hyper-aware calm where time seemed to stretch and every detail acquired crystalline clarity. He waited. The jungle returned to its normal rhythms. A parrot screamed somewhere in the canopy. Insects whined around his head, landing on his neck, his face, his hands. He ignored them. His eye remained fixed on the scope's sight picture, watching for movement, for irregularity, for the kind of subtle wrongness that marked human presence in an inhuman place. 15 minutes passed. Then, in his peripheral vision, not through the scope, but with his naked left eye, he caught it. Movement, slight but definite, in a section of jungle approximately 20 yards left of where he'd been aiming. He shifted his eye to the scope, moving only the eyeball, keeping his head perfectly still. Through the magnified circle of vision, he saw what his peripheral vision had detected. A Japanese soldier, partially concealed behind a fallen log, his upper body visible, his arms raised, holding binoculars to his eyes. The man was staring directly at the decoy position. Leonard's crosshairs found the soldier's chest, center mass, the way they'd taught him at Lejeune. Breathe out, slow and steady. The crosshairs rose slightly with his heartbeat, fell slightly with his exhalation. At the bottom of the breath cycle, when his lungs were empty and his body was still, he increased pressure on the trigger. The Springfield roared. The stock punched his shoulder. The scope picture blurred with recoil, and when it settled, the Japanese soldier was gone, dropped behind the log, dead or dying. Leonard didn't wait to confirm. He was already rolling left, away from his firing position, moving to a backup location 15 yards distant that he'd prepared the previous day. The Japanese might have spotted his muzzle flash. They might respond with return fire or even artillery. Standard sniper doctrine, never fire twice from the same position. But no return fire came. The jungle absorbed the sound of his shot and returned to silence. After 5 minutes, Leonard crawled back to his primary position and examined the kill zone through binoculars. He could see the fallen log clearly now, and behind it, visible only because he knew exactly where to look, the dark shape of a body. The soldier had fallen backward, arms sprawled. The binoculars lay in the mud beside him. One confirmed kill. One Japanese observer eliminated. And more importantly, proof that the theory worked. The soup can trick wasn't just a decoy. It was a weapon that turned the enemy's training and instincts against him. Japanese snipers were taught to observe, to investigate irregularities, to report unusual activity. That discipline, that professionalism, had made them deadly. And now Leonard had found a way to transform their greatest strength into a fatal vulnerability. He spent the next hour refining the technique. He experimented with different flash patterns, quick bursts versus sustained reflection, random intervals versus regular ones. He tested different positions for the decoy, moving it to various locations within his area of operations. He observed which positions drew the most attention, which angles of reflection were most visible from the Japanese lines, which times of day provided the best light conditions. By mid-morning, he'd attracted and killed 2 more enemy soldiers, both observers, both caught in the act of investigating the mysterious flashes of light in the American-held jungle. Over the next 4 days, Staff Sergeant Leonard Smith refined his technique into something approaching art. He constructed 5 additional decoys from scavenged soup cans, condensed milk tins, and a reflective signal mirror that he deliberately damaged to reduce its effectiveness. An intact signal mirror would be too obviously military equipment. Each decoy was positioned in a different location within his expanding area of operations, creating a network of potential light sources spread across nearly half a mile of frontline territory. He couldn't monitor all of them simultaneously, but he didn't need to. The Japanese didn't know how many American snipers were employing this tactic. Each flash of light represented a potential target, a potential threat that demanded investigation. The control systems evolved. He used longer lengths of parachute cord, sometimes running them through improvised pulleys made from Y-shaped branches to change the direction of pull. This allowed him to operate decoys from positions far removed from their physical locations, reducing the risk of counter-battery fire. He developed a repertoire of flash patterns, each designed to simulate different types of careless behavior. The slow, steady sweep of a soldier scanning with binoculars. The quick flash of sunlight off a moving rifle barrel. The sustained reflection of someone who'd foolishly positioned themselves in direct sunlight. But the true sophistication of his campaign lay in its psychological dimension. Leonard understood, perhaps instinctively, that he wasn't simply killing individual soldiers. He was waging war on enemy confidence and morale. Each unexplained death, each mysterious flash of light, followed by the crack of a distant rifle, contributed to a growing sense of dread and paranoia among Japanese positions. By November 13th, his confirmed kill count had reached 47. The number was itself almost meaningless, a statistical abstraction divorced from the reality of 47 individual human deaths. But within that number lay something more significant. the systematic dismantling of the Japanese 57th Regiment's observation and intelligence network. Smith wasn't randomly killing soldiers. He was specifically targeting observers, spotters, forward artillery controllers, and sniper team leaders, the men whose job was to watch the American positions and coordinate responses. These were trained specialists, difficult to replace, their loss cascading through the entire command structure. Through captured documents and interrogation of prisoners taken in other sectors, American intelligence began to piece together the Japanese perspective on what was happening. The picture that emerged was one of mounting confusion and terror. Major Kyoto Nakamura stood in his headquarters bunker, a reinforced cave system approximately 3 miles inland from the American beachhead, and read the reports with growing disbelief. The cave was cool, damp, lit by a single kerosene lantern that threw dancing shadows against the rough stone walls. Outside, the jungle steamed in the midday heat. Inside, Nakamura felt cold. The reports came from all along his defensive line. Observers disappearing, sniper teams going silent, forward positions reporting strange lights in the American sector, followed by accurate rifle fire from unexpected angles. In 3 days, he'd lost 23 specialists, scouts, snipers, artillery spotters, to an enemy that seemed to have developed the ability to see through jungle concealment and strike with supernatural precision. His intelligence officer, Lieutenant Tanaka, stood at attention beside the cave's entrance. The man looked exhausted, his uniform stained with mud and sweat, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Explain this to me again," Nakamura said, his voice carefully controlled. "How is this possible?" Tanaka swallowed. "Sir, the pattern is consistent across all sectors. Our observers report seeing flashes of light in the American-held jungle. Not artillery flashes or muzzle fire, but reflected light, like sunlight catching on metal or glass. When our men investigate or attempt to locate the source, they are shot by an American marksman who appears to be positioned at a considerable distance from the light source." "A decoy," Nakamura said. "Yes, sir, we believe so, but—" Tanaka hesitated. "But what?" "Sir, the lights appear in multiple locations simultaneously, sometimes 5 or 6 different positions at once. Either the Americans have deployed numerous sniper teams, which our own observations suggest they have not, or they have developed some method of operating these decoys remotely. And the timing suggests coordination. The lights appear when our observation posts are most active, during dawn and dusk, when visibility is optimal." Nakamura set down the reports and walked to the cave entrance, looking out at the green wall of jungle. Somewhere in that vegetation, invisible and untouchable, the Americans had found a way to turn Japanese tactical doctrine against itself. The 57th Regiment had spent months mastering the art of concealment and observation. Now that very skill was being used to kill them. "Our snipers are afraid to investigate suspicious activity," Tanaka continued quietly. "They're afraid to use their binoculars. Some are refusing to maintain their observation schedule. The men are saying the Americans have developed a new weapon. They call it Akuma no Hikari, the demon light." The demon light. Nakamura almost smiled at the superstition, but the smile died before it reached his face. Superstition or not, the effect was real. His carefully constructed intelligence network was collapsing. Without observers, he was blind. Without forward spotters, his artillery was useless. Without sniper teams, the Americans could advance with impunity. And all because of flashes of light and a single American marksman. No, that couldn't be right. It had to be more than one man. The pattern was too widespread, too consistent. Unless— "How many separate incidents have been reported?" Nakamura asked. Tanaka consulted his notes. 53 confirmed engagements since November 11th, sir. 47 confirmed kills, 6 wounded. "And how many different American snipers have been identified?" A pause. "The reports suggest— possibly 1, sir. The shot placement is remarkably consistent. Single shots, center mass, or headshots, always from elevated positions approximately 150 to 250 meters distant. Our observers who survived their wounds report the sound signature is consistent with the American Springfield rifle. 1 man, 1 rifle, 47 kills in 3 days. Nakamura felt something shift in his understanding of the tactical situation. This wasn't a new weapon or a coordinated American campaign. This was a single individual who'd identified a vulnerability in Japanese doctrine and was exploiting it with devastating effectiveness. The demon light wasn't supernatural. It was simple, crude, brilliant psychology. New orders, Nakamura said. All observation posts are to ignore reflective light sources unless accompanied by other signs of enemy activity. No one investigates light flashes. No one uses binoculars during dawn or dusk hours. Forward positions withdraw to secondary concealment during periods of optimal light conditions. Snipers operate in pairs, with one man watching for the American marksman while the other observes enemy positions. Tanaka bowed. Yes, sir. But they both knew the truth. These orders represented a fundamental retreat from the aggressive observation doctrine that had made the 57th Regiment so effective. By refusing to investigate suspicious activity, they were voluntarily blinding themselves. The Americans had found a way to make Japanese caution and Japanese aggression equally fatal. Investigate the lights, and you die. Ignore the lights, and you miss critical intelligence that might kill you later. It was a perfect tactical trap, and Nakamura could see no way out of it except to kill the man responsible. Leonard Smith was unaware of the strategic impact of his campaign. He knew he was killing enemy soldiers. The bodies visible through his scope provided that confirmation. But he couldn't know how those deaths were cascading through the Japanese command structure. Couldn't hear the conversations in Major Nakamura's headquarters, couldn't feel the spreading fear among enemy observers who now saw demon lights in every flash of sunlight. All he knew was that the technique worked and that each day brought new opportunities to refine it. By November 14th, his kill count had reached 89. He'd expanded his area of operations to cover nearly a full mile of front line, moving between positions with the careful patience his grandfather had taught him. He slept in 2-hour increments, always during the hours when sunlight was wrong for the decoys, between 1100 and 1400 hours when the sun was directly overhead and produced minimal angular reflection. He ate cold rations, drank water collected from leaves during the nightly rains, and maintained his rifle with the obsessive attention of a man whose life depended on mechanical precision. His body was failing. He'd lost perhaps 20 pounds in 2 weeks of combat, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had always been lean, but was now approaching skeletal. Mosquito bites covered his exposed skin in red welts. A fungal infection had started between his toes and was spreading slowly upward. His hands trembled constantly now, though he could still control them during the critical seconds of aiming and firing. But his mind remained sharp, focused with the intensity of a man who'd found his purpose. Every kill saved American lives. Every Japanese observer he eliminated was one less source of intelligence for enemy artillery, one less sniper positioning report, one less early warning of American movements. The mathematics were simple and compelling. On the morning of November 15th, he set up 3 decoys in a triangular pattern covering approaches to a river ford that 2nd Battalion was planning to use for a crossing operation. The ford was currently under Japanese observation from unknown positions. Leonard's job was to clear those positions before the crossing began at 1400 hours. He activated the first decoy at 0615 hours, letting it throw random flashes toward the far bank of the river. Within 10 minutes, he'd drawn fire from a Japanese position concealed in the riverbank reeds. The enemy sniper had broken discipline, shooting at the decoy instead of investigating it. Amateur mistake. Leonard noted the muzzle flash location and fired 3 rounds into the reeds, working in a methodical pattern. On the 3rd shot, a figure stumbled out of concealment and collapsed at the water's edge. 90 kills. The second decoy, activated at 0700 hours, drew more cautious attention. Leonard watched through his scope as vegetation stirred in a grove of bamboo approximately 230 yards distant. Someone was moving, trying to flank the decoy position. Leonard waited, patient as stone, until the figure emerged far enough to present a clear target. The Springfield cracked once. The figure dropped. 91 kills. The third decoy was the masterpiece. Leonard had positioned it on a small rise that offered excellent visibility across the ford. When he activated it at 0745 hours, he didn't aim it at the Japanese positions. Instead, he aimed it at his own previous firing position, the location where he'd been when he'd fired at the bamboo grove. The psychology was subtle but devastatingly effective. Any Japanese observer watching the area would see light flashing from what they might have identified as the American sniper's position. They would assume Leonard was still there, careless or desperate enough to give away his location. They would have a clear shot at what they thought was their tormentor. And when they took that shot, they would expose themselves to Leonard's rifle, firing from a completely different location 200 yards south. At 0812 hours, a Japanese sniper took the bait. Leonard saw the muzzle flash from an elevated position in a tall fig tree. The shot was perfect. It would have killed him instantly if he'd actually been at the decoy position. But he wasn't. He was in a depression behind a fallen log, his scope already tracking to the source of the flash. Through the magnified circle of his sight picture, he could see the sniper clearly now. A man in his 30s, his face painted with mud and leaves, his body strapped to the tree trunk with rope to maintain stability. A professional, a skilled opponent, but also a man who'd just made the fatal mistake of revealing his position. Leonard's crosshairs settled on the sniper's chest. He exhaled slowly. The rifle roared. The Japanese sniper slumped in his bindings, held in place by the rope even in death. 92 kills. Leonard allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The ford was clear. 2nd Battalion could cross without taking observer fire. American lives were saved. Then he heard the sound that changed everything. Voices, close, speaking rapid Japanese. He'd made a mistake. Fatal. Stupid. The kind of error green troops made, not experienced snipers. He'd been so focused on the decoys, on the hunt, on the next kill, that he'd stopped monitoring his flanks adequately. The Japanese hadn't sent observers to investigate the demon light. They'd sent infantry, a full squad, moving through the jungle with the quiet efficiency of men who'd been training for exactly this kind of operation. They were 20 yards away and closing. Leonard grabbed his rifle and rolled out of his depression, scrambling for the cover of a dense thicket. He made it perhaps 10 feet before the first burst of machine gun fire chewed through the vegetation where he'd been lying. He dove forward, felt something punch into his left thigh. Not a bullet, he realized with strange clarity, but a bamboo stake. One of the sharpened punji stakes the Japanese used in their defensive perimeters. The stake had been concealed under leaf litter, and he'd landed directly on it. It penetrated his thigh muscle to a depth of perhaps 3 inches, the sharpened tip scraping against his femur. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. A white-hot flower of agony that blossomed from his leg and spread through his entire body. He bit down hard on his own hand to keep from screaming, tasting blood from where his teeth broke skin. More gunfire, bullets snapping through leaves, thudding into tree trunks, voices shouting in Japanese. They were surrounding his position, moving to cut off escape routes. Leonard's training took over. He couldn't run. The stake in his leg made sure of that. He couldn't fight. He was outnumbered at least 12-1, and his rifle was a bolt-action weapon designed for precision, not close combat. His only option was surrender, and surrender meant capture, interrogation, likely execution. He'd heard the stories about what happened to American prisoners, especially snipers. The Japanese considered snipers to be dishonorable fighters, not worthy of military courtesy. There were documented cases of captured American snipers being tortured, beheaded, even crucified as examples. But survival instinct overrode fear. Leonard raised his hands, slowly, keeping them visible. He called out the only Japanese word he knew, "Toko," surrender. The gunfire stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, figures emerged from the jungle. Japanese soldiers, their rifles trained on him, their faces expressionless. One of them, a sergeant by his insignia, approached cautiously and kicked Leonard's rifle away. Another soldier grabbed Leonard's arms and pulled them behind his back, binding his wrists with rough rope. They hauled him to his feet. The movement drove the punji stake deeper into his leg, and this time Leonard couldn't contain his scream. The world grayed at the edges. He felt himself falling, but hands caught him, held him upright. Through the fog of pain, he heard an officer speaking, not to him, but to the soldiers. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was clear, excited, triumphant. They knew who they'd captured. The Demon Light's source. The sniper who'd killed nearly 100 of their comrades. They dragged him through the jungle, moving east toward Japanese lines. Leonard tried to track their route, tried to maintain situational awareness, but the pain in his leg was too intense. He counted steps mechanically, 100, 200, 500, knowing the information was useless but unable to stop himself. His grandfather had taught him, a hunter always knows where he is. After what might have been an hour, they reached a Japanese position, a series of reinforced bunkers connected by trenches, camouflaged so perfectly that Leonard saw them only when he was already inside them. They threw him into a bunker, more accurately, a cage, constructed from bamboo poles and sunk partially underground. The space was perhaps 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, too small to stand, barely large enough to lie down. The earthen floor was damp and smelled of rot. Leonard collapsed in the corner, his wounded leg stretched out before him. In the dim light filtering through the bamboo bars, he could see the punji stake was still embedded in his thigh, its sharpened tip visible through the torn fabric of his trousers. Blood was seeping steadily from the wound, not arterial spray, but enough to be concerning. He was going to die here, either from blood loss, from infection, or from whatever the Japanese had planned for the Demon Light sniper. Hours passed. The pain in his leg evolved from sharp agony to a deep, throbbing ache. He tried to pull out the stake, but couldn't get adequate leverage in the confined space. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body. Thirst began to compete with pain for his attention. He hadn't drunk water since before dawn, and the tropical heat was leaching moisture from his body with brutal efficiency. As darkness fell, Japanese soldiers came to the cage. 2 of them, officers judging by their uniforms. They stood outside the bamboo bars and spoke to each other, occasionally glancing at Leonard with expressions that mixed curiosity and contempt. One of them pointed at Leonard's wounded leg and said something that made the other laugh. They left without speaking to him. Leonard lay in the darkness, feeling his life leaking away through the hole in his leg, and tried to prepare himself for death. November 16th, 1943, time unknown. Leonard woke to the sound of artillery, not the distant rumble he'd grown accustomed to, but close, earth-shaking explosions that made the bamboo cage rattle. American artillery, he realized. Very close. Too close. The Japanese position was in chaos. Soldiers were running, shouting, preparing defensive positions. In the confusion, no one paid attention to the cage or its occupant. Then Leonard heard a sound that made no sense. English. American voices, calling to each other, coordinating movement. An assault. American forces had pushed into this sector, driven deep enough to reach the Japanese second line. Leonard's cage was in the middle of a combat zone. He tried to call out, to signal his presence, but his throat was too dry to make more than a croak. The battle raged around him. Rifle fire, grenade explosions, the distinctive chatter of a Thompson submachine gun. A figure appeared at the cage entrance, an American Marine, his uniform caked with mud, his eyes wide with combat adrenaline. He stared at Leonard for a moment, processing the sight of an American soldier inside a Japanese cage. "Jesus Christ," the Marine said. "Corpsman! Corpsman!" More figures appeared. Someone was cutting through the bamboo bars with a machete. Hands reached in, grabbed Leonard, pulled him out into the gray dawn light. He tried to tell them about the stake in his leg, but the words wouldn't form. Everything was spinning, tilting, fading. A corpsman knelt beside him. Leonard could see the red cross on his helmet and examined the wound. The man's face went pale. "We need to get him back now," the corpsman said. "He's lost a lot of blood. That stake's been in there for hours. Infection risk is critical." They carried him on a stretcher, moving fast through the jungle. Leonard drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of motion, pain, voices. At some point, the jungle sounds faded, replaced by different sounds: engines, radios, organized activity. He opened his eyes and found himself in a field hospital, a collection of tents near the beach. Medical personnel moved with practiced efficiency around him. Someone was cutting away his trousers. Someone else was establishing an intravenous line in his arm. A doctor was examining the punji stake still embedded in his thigh. "I need to remove this now," the doctor said. "No time to wait for full anesthesia. Hold him down." Hands gripped Leonard's shoulders and arms. The doctor grasped the stake and pulled. The pain was transcendent, beyond anything Leonard had imagined possible. He heard himself screaming as if from a great distance. Then, darkness. November 17th, 1943, Field Hospital Alpha, Tropical Bay Island. Leonard woke in a cot, in a tent, with sunlight filtering through canvas overhead. His left leg was wrapped in clean white bandages and elevated on a pillow. An IV drip was connected to his arm. The pain in his leg had diminished to a manageable throb. He was alive. More than that, he'd received immediate medical treatment. The stake had been removed, the wound cleaned and debrided, antibiotics administered. There'd been no waiting, no triage system that left him at the back of the line. Despite being just one wounded soldier among hundreds, he'd been treated as a priority case. A nurse noticed he was awake and approached his cot. She was perhaps 25, her face tired but kind, her hands competent as she checked his pulse. "Welcome back, Sergeant," she said. "You gave us quite a scare. That wound was infected pretty badly, but the doctor thinks you'll keep the leg. You're lucky those Marines found you when they did." Lucky. The word seemed absurd. He'd been captured, stabbed, left to die in a cage. But she was right. He was lucky to be alive. How long? His voice was a rasp. She held a cup of water to his lips, and he drank gratefully. "You've been here 20 hours, she said. "The doctor operated on you within 30 minutes of your arrival, removed the foreign material, cleaned the wound, started you on sulfa drugs. Standard procedure for penetrating trauma. 30 minutes. No waiting line, no triage delay. Immediate surgery for a single wounded soldier." Leonard thought about what he'd heard, rumors, stories from other veterans, about how the Japanese treated their own wounded. In the Japanese military culture, being wounded was almost shameful. Medical resources were limited and prioritized for soldiers who could return to combat quickly. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given minimal care or even abandoned. There were documented cases of Japanese soldiers committing suicide rather than burden their units with care for non-combat effective personnel. But here, in this American field hospital, he'd received surgery within 30 minutes. Not because he was special. He could see dozens of other wounded men in the tent, all receiving similar care. But because that was standard procedure. Every wounded soldier was valuable. Every life was worth saving. The shock of it was profound. He'd spent the last 2 weeks killing Japanese soldiers with methodical efficiency, had accumulated nearly 100 confirmed kills, had waged psychological warfare against an entire regiment. He'd done it without hesitation, without remorse, because that was his job, and those were the enemy. But lying in this cot, his life saved by the immediate and competent care of American military medicine, Leonard Smith understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The fundamental difference in how each side valued human life. Not abstract propaganda, not military doctrine, but demonstrated reality. He was worth saving immediately, without question, without hesitation. His survival mattered enough to commit significant resources and skilled personnel to preserve it. He wondered if any Japanese soldier received the same treatment. Staff Sergeant Leonard Smith spent 6 weeks recovering in the field hospital on Tropical Bay Island, then another 3 months at the Naval Hospital in Pearl Harbor. The punji stake wound healed slowly, complicated by infection that required 2 additional surgeries, and left him with a pronounced limp and chronic pain that would plague him for the rest of his life. The doctors told him he was lucky. The stake had missed his femoral artery by less than half an inch. If it had struck that artery, he would have bled out in the Japanese cage within 30 minutes. But the physical wound was only part of the injury. While Smith lay recovering, American intelligence officers compiled the aftermath of his 5-day campaign. The numbers told a story that seemed almost impossible. 112 confirmed kills between November 10th and November 15th, 1943. Not estimates, not probable kills, but confirmed. Bodies seen, positions verified, Japanese casualties documented through captured records and prisoner interrogations. The tally broke down as follows: 37 snipers and designated marksmen, 42 observers and forward spotters, 19 artillery controllers and fire direction personnel, 8 communication specialists, and 6 officers of various ranks. The Japanese 57th Infantry Regiment's entire intelligence and observation network had been systematically dismantled by a single Marine with a rifle and a collection of soup cans. But the numbers alone didn't capture the true impact. The captured documents told a more complete story. On November 23, 1943, a Marine patrol overran a Japanese command post approximately 4 miles inland from the beach. Among the papers recovered from the position was a leather-bound journal belonging to Major Kyoto Nakamura, commanding officer of the 57th Regiment. The journal was translated by Japanese-American linguists and forwarded to Marine Corps Intelligence Headquarters. The entries from mid-November made for remarkable reading. November 12, 1943. The situation continues to deteriorate. We have lost 16 observers in 2 days to an American sniper of exceptional skill. My intelligence officer reports the Americans have deployed some form of signaling device or reflective apparatus that draws our men's attention, then positions them for execution. The men are calling it Akuma no Hikari, demon light. Morale is suffering. Several observation posts have requested permission to abandon their positions during daylight hours. I have denied these requests. We must maintain our vigilance regardless of casualties. November 13, 1943. 23 more dead today. The American is no longer confining his activities to a single sector. The demon lights appear across our entire defensive line. Either he has multiplied himself, or he is moving between positions with supernatural speed. My officers are reporting that our sniper teams refuse to investigate suspicious activity. They claim the lights are cursed, that looking at them brings death. This is superstitious nonsense, but I cannot entirely blame them. I have reviewed the casualty reports. Every man who attempted to locate the source of these lights has died. The American has achieved what no amount of artillery or air attack could accomplish. He has made our soldiers afraid to observe the enemy. November 14, 1943. I have implemented new protocols. No investigation of light sources, paired observation teams, restricted use of optical equipment during optimal light conditions. But these measures represent a fundamental compromise of our doctrine. By not investigating suspicious activity, we are voluntarily blinding ourselves to potential threats. By restricting observation schedules, we are creating predictable gaps in our intelligence coverage. The American has trapped us. To follow our training means death. To abandon our training means defeat. I see no solution. November 15, 1943. Total casualties from the Demon Light campaign now exceed 90 personnel, with significant losses among our most experienced observers and snipers. The regiment's combat effectiveness has been severely degraded. I have requested reinforcement of our sniper and observation units from division headquarters, but no replacements are available. The American offensive in the northern sector has diverted all reserves. We are fighting blind, and the Americans know it. I expect a major assault within days. We will resist, but without adequate intelligence, our defensive positions are compromised. One man, one resourceful, clever, diabolical man, has achieved what an entire battalion could not. If I survive this battle, I will recommend this technique be studied and countered in future operations. The Americans have found a weakness in our doctrine that I did not know existed. This was the last entry in Major Nakamura's journal. He was killed 3 days later when American forces overran his headquarters position during the final push to secure the island's airfield. The journal, along with other captured documents and testimony from Japanese prisoners, painted a picture of psychological warfare so effective it had essentially paralyzed an entire regiment's intelligence apparatus. The soup can trick hadn't just killed soldiers, it had killed their confidence, their willingness to perform their duties, their trust in their own training. Marine Corps intelligence recognized the significance immediately. This wasn't just an isolated incident of individual ingenuity. It was a case study in asymmetric warfare, in how creativity and psychological insight could multiply combat effectiveness far beyond what traditional tactics could achieve. In January of 1944, the Marine Corps schools at Quantico, Virginia, received a detailed after-action report on the Tropical Bay Island campaign, with specific focus on Staff Sergeant Smith's tactical innovation. The report included technical diagrams of the decoy apparatus, analysis of the psychological principles involved, recommendations for training implementation, and cautionary notes about overuse leading to enemy adaptation. By March of 1944, the reflective decoy technique, officially, though Marines continued to call it the soup can trick, had been incorporated into the Scout Sniper School curriculum as an example of effective field expedient. Psychological deception. Instructors used it to teach broader principles, understanding enemy doctrine and psychology, exploiting enemy strengths as vulnerabilities, maintaining operational creativity, using environmental factors as force multipliers. The technique saw limited use in subsequent Pacific campaigns. A few Marine snipers employed variations of it during operations on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, with mixed results. The Japanese had learned from their experience on Tropical Bay Island and had modified their doctrine accordingly. But the principle remained valuable. When facing a prepared and entrenched enemy, sometimes the most effective weapon is one that turns their preparation against them. Leonard Smith was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions on Tropical Bay Island. The citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism while serving as a scout sniper with the 1st Marine Division during operations against enemy Japanese forces on Tropical Bay Island from November 10th through November 15th, 1915. 43. Demonstrating exceptional tactical innovation and sustained courage under fire, Staff Sergeant Smith single-handedly neutralized the enemy's observation and intelligence network through the development and employment of novel deception techniques. His actions directly contributed to the successful advance of American forces and the ultimate securing of strategic objectives. By his courage, tactical brilliance, and unwavering dedication to duty, Staff Sergeant Smith reflected great credit upon himself and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The medal was presented to him in a ceremony at Pearl Harbor in February of 1944. He accepted it with the uncomfortable awareness that 112 men had died so he could wear a ribbon on his chest. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor, and he couldn't entirely convince himself he deserved it. He'd been a hunter in the woods, doing what he'd always done, applying skills his grandfather had taught him to a different kind of prey. That it had been effective, even devastatingly so, didn't make it feel heroic. He was discharged from the Marine Corps in July of 1944, medically retired due to the permanent damage to his left leg. The doctors told him he'd never fully recover his mobility, that the infection had caused too much soft tissue damage. He walked with a cane for the rest of his life. He returned to Harlan County, Kentucky, to a town that had changed little in his absence. The mines were still running, the hills were still green in summer and white in winter. Life continued with the same rhythms it had followed for generations. He married his high school sweetheart, Ruth Ann Walker, in September of 1944. They had 3 children. He worked as a supervisor at the Mine Safety Office, a job that accommodated his limited mobility and drew on his attention to detail and ability to spot dangerous situations before they became critical. He rarely spoke about the war. When other veterans gathered to tell stories, and Harlan County had sent many sons to the Pacific, Leonard would listen but contribute little. His children learned early not to ask about his service. The Navy Cross sat in a drawer in his bedroom, unworn, unmentioned. Only Ruth Ann knew that he sometimes woke in the night, sweating and shaking, seeing flashes of light in the darkness behind his closed eyes. In 1968, a Marine Corps historian conducting research on Pacific War sniper operations tracked Leonard down and requested an interview. Leonard initially declined, but Ruth Ann convinced him to participate. The historian, a captain named Morrison, spent 3 days in Harlan County, recording Leonard's memories and asking detailed questions about the soup can trick. "Do you regret it?" Morrison asked on the final day. "The technique? The kills? Any of it?" Leonard thought for a long time before answering. They were sitting on the porch of his small house, looking out over the green Kentucky hills that looked nothing like the jungles of the South Pacific, but somehow still reminded him of that other war, that other life. "I regret the war," he finally said. "I regret that it had to happen, that all those men, theirs and ours, had to die. But do I regret what I did? No. I was a soldier. I had a job. I found a way to do it effectively. Every Japanese soldier I killed was one less man shooting at Marines, one less artillery spotter calling fire down on our positions, one less sniper waiting in the trees. I saved American lives. That's what matters." "But the technique itself," Morrison pressed. "It was psychological warfare. You were exploiting their training, their curiosity, their sense of duty. Some people might say that's not honorable combat." Leonard looked at the younger man with something like pity. "Son, there's no such thing as honorable combat. There's effective combat and ineffective combat. There's winning and dying. The Japanese didn't care about honor when they were shooting our boys from hidden positions, when they were booby-trapping trails, when they were fighting from caves and making every yard cost us blood. They were using every advantage they had. All I did was find an advantage they didn't expect. That's not dishonorable. That's war." "And the medical treatment?" Morrison asked. "Your journal mentions being shocked by how quickly you received surgery after being rescued." "That," Leonard said, his voice softer now, "that was when I understood we were fighting for something real. Not propaganda, not flag-waving patriotism, but actual human values. They treated me like my life mattered. Not because I was special, not because of what I'd done, but because I was an American soldier, and that meant something. Every wounded man in that hospital got the same care. We didn't leave men behind. We didn't abandon the wounded. We valued human life enough to commit resources to saving it. That's worth fighting for." The interview was published in the Marine Corps Gazette in 1969 under the title Innovation Under Fire: Scout Sniper Operations on Tropical Bay Island. It became required reading at the Scout Sniper School and was reprinted numerous times in various military journals and tactical publications. Leonard Smith died on March 7, 1996, at the age of 73, in the same house where he'd lived for 50 years. He was buried in the Harlan County Veterans Cemetery with full military honors. The Marine Corps sent a color guard, a young sniper from the current generation of Scout snipers, a corporal who'd studied Leonard's techniques at school, delivered the eulogy, and explained to the gathered mourners how one man with a soup can had changed the way the Marine Corps thought about tactical deception. Ruth Ann Smith, sitting in the front row with her children and grandchildren, listened to the eulogy and thought about the man she'd married. Not the war hero, not the tactical innovator, not the legend in Marine Corps training manuals, but the man who'd come home with a limp and nightmares, who'd never bragged about his service, who'd lived quietly and died peacefully. The man who'd been, above all else, a hunter who understood that survival meant adaptation, and that sometimes the difference between life and death came down to seeing possibilities others missed. After the service, she was approached by a Marine colonel, an older man with gray hair and a chest full of ribbons. "Mrs. Smith," he said, "I wanted you to know that your husband's legacy continues. We still teach the soup can trick, though we use more sophisticated equipment now, at every Scout Sniper School course. But more than the technique, we teach the principle: creativity in combat, thinking beyond doctrine, using the environment and the enemy's own psychology against them." Every Marine sniper who graduates knows the story of Staff Sergeant Leonard Smith and Tropical Bay Island. He's part of our tradition now." Ruth Ann nodded, accepting this with the grace of someone who'd lived with heroism for 50 years and knew it was both more and less than the world believed it to be. "He was just doing his job," she said. "That's what he always told me. He was doing what needed to be done, the best way he knew how." "Yes, ma'am," the colonel said, "but the best way he knew how saved hundreds of American lives and changed how we think about warfare. That's not just doing a job, that's genius." Ruth Ann didn't argue, but she knew Leonard would have. He'd never seen himself as a genius, never thought of his innovation as anything more than practical adaptation to circumstances. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about him, the absolute absence of ego about his accomplishment. He'd found a vulnerability, exploited it, achieved extraordinary results, and then moved on with his life as if it were no more significant than hitting a squirrel from 80 yards on a Kentucky hillside. Which, in his mind, it probably wasn't. The story of Leonard Smith and the soup can trick raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare, innovation, and human psychology. On one level, it's a tale of individual ingenuity triumphing over institutional doctrine. Smith wasn't following a manual or implementing a taught technique. He was improvising, adapting, creating something new from materials at hand and observation of enemy behavior. This kind of innovation is celebrated in military culture precisely because it represents the triumph of human creativity over rigid systems. But on another level, the story reveals the terrifying efficiency with which psychological manipulation can be weaponized. Smith didn't just kill enemy soldiers. He systematically exploited their training, their sense of duty, their natural human curiosity, and turned these qualities into vulnerabilities. The Japanese soldiers who investigated the demon lights weren't being careless or stupid. They were following their training, doing their jobs, responding to potential threats exactly as they'd been taught to respond. And they died for it. This raises a philosophical question. Is there a moral difference between killing someone through superior marksmanship and killing someone by tricking them into exposing themselves? Traditional military ethics would say no, both are legitimate tactics of war. But there's something disturbing about the psychological dimension of Smith's campaign, the way it turned enemy professionalism into a death sentence. The captured Japanese documents reveal men who understood exactly what was happening to them, but could find no effective counter. Major Nakamura's journal entries show a thoughtful, intelligent officer wrestling with an impossible tactical problem. He recognized the trap, but couldn't escape it. To investigate suspicious activity meant death. To ignore suspicious activity meant tactical blindness. Either choice led to defeat. This is psychological warfare at its most effective, creating situations where every rational option leads to failure. The broader implication is that warfare increasingly isn't about who has the most firepower or the best training. It's about who can think more creatively, who can identify and exploit vulnerabilities others don't see, who can turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. Smith's soup can trick was revolutionary, not because it was technologically sophisticated, it wasn't, but because it represented a fundamental shift in thinking about how to fight. The fact that the technique became largely ineffective after the Japanese adapted to it doesn't diminish its importance. Innovation in warfare is always temporary. Every tactical advance generates a defensive counter, which generates a new offensive technique in an endless cycle. What matters is the willingness to think creatively, to question assumptions, to experiment with unconventional approaches. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Smith's story isn't the technique itself, but what happened after his capture and wounding. The immediate, competent medical care he received, the fact that his life was valued enough to warrant emergency surgery within 30 minutes, represents a fundamental statement about the relative value American and Japanese military cultures place on individual human life. This wasn't propaganda. This was demonstrated reality, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific theater. American military medicine was remarkable, not because it was technologically superior, though it was, but because it embodied a philosophical commitment to saving lives that exceeded pure military utility. Wounded soldiers received care not because they could return to combat, but because they were human beings whose suffering mattered. The Japanese military culture, by contrast, often treated wounded soldiers as burdens, their suffering as shameful, their survival as secondary to the needs of the unit. This wasn't because Japanese soldiers were less human or less compassionate individually. It was a systemic difference in how the two cultures thought about the relationship between the individual and the collective. Smith recognized this difference immediately upon waking in the American field hospital. The shock he felt that he'd received priority medical care despite being one wounded soldier among hundreds revealed how deeply he'd internalized the expectation of being expendable. His survival mattered. The system had committed significant resources to ensuring it. That realization, perhaps more than the 112 kills, or the Navy Cross, or the incorporation of his technique into Marine Corps doctrine, defined what the war meant to him. In the end, the story of the soup can trick is about more than tactical innovation or psychological warfare. It's about what happens when human creativity confronts human conflict, when individual ingenuity operates within systems designed for organized violence, when the value of human life becomes not an abstract principle, but a demonstrated commitment. Leonard Smith went into the jungle with a rifle and a soup can and found a way to win an unwinnable fight. But he came out of it understanding that the real victory wasn't the 112 enemy soldiers he killed. It was the fact that his own side valued him enough to ensure he survived to tell the story. That understanding, more than any medal or commendation, was what he carried with him for the rest of his life.